countryside always seems so calm, doesn't it? A quiet escape from the chaos of life. But sometimes that quiet hides something much darker. In these farm horror stories, we'll dive into terrifying encounters that will make you think twice about those peaceful fields and barns. From eerie whispers in the cornfields and shadowy figures in the hayloft to an ancient well with a sinister secret and something watching from the woods. Each story gets creepier as it goes. These aren't just scary tales, they're the kind of stories that stay with you long after the lights are out. Story 1. The Lantern in the Hayloft. I've always hated going into the barn at night, but that night, something was waiting for me. I grew up on a farm in the Midwest. It was a quiet place, miles away from any neighbor, surrounded by fields that stretched farther than the eye could see. As a kid, I loved it, but as I got older, the isolation started to feel different, especially at night. The barn was a towering structure, built long before I was born, with creaky beams and a hayloft that seemed to loom over everything. My dad always warned me about climbing up there. It wasn't safe, he said. The boards were old and one wrong step could send you falling straight through. I never needed much convincing. The hayloft gave me the creeps, even in the daytime. That night, a storm was rolling in. The kind where the wind howls through every crack in the walls and lightning splits the sky like it's tearing something apart. I was 16 and my parents had gone into town for supplies, leaving me to keep an eye on things. Just before the rain started, I realized I'd forgotten to check on the horses. I hesitated, staring out at the barn through the window. The wind was already whipping the trees and the barn door banged against the frame, even though I swore I'd latched it earlier. It was just the wind, I told myself, nothing to worry about. Grabbing my flashlight, I pulled on my boots and jacket and headed out. The rain hadn't started yet, but the air was heavy, electric. Every step felt harder than it should have, like the night was pushing back against me. When I reached the barn, I swung the door open and stepped inside. The smell of hay and damp wood hit me instantly, familiar and comforting. But there was something else, a faint metallic tang in the air. I told myself it was just my imagination and walked toward the stalls. The horses were restless, their eyes wide and glossy, their ears twitching at every creak and groan of the barn. I moved from stall to stall, murmuring to them, trying to calm them down. That's when I saw it, the faint glow coming from the hayloft. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe my flashlight reflecting off something. But no, it was steady, flickering, like firelight. A lantern. My heart started pounding. No one was supposed to be up there. No one could be up there. My parents weren't home, and I hadn't heard anyone come onto the property. I turned off my flashlight, suddenly wanting to stay hidden, and crept closer to the ladder that led up to the loft. The glow was brighter now, casting long shadows down the wall. That's when I heard it. The sound of whispering. It wasn't loud, just a soft murmur, like someone trying not to be heard. But the barn was silent enough that it carried. My breath caught in my throat. The whispers didn't sound like words exactly, just noises, overlapping and blending into each other. I gripped the ladder, my hands shaking. I didn't want to climb up there. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to run back to the house and lock the doors. But I couldn't. The glow of the lantern and the whispers felt like a dare, like something was waiting for me to find it. The wood creaked under my weight as I climbed, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the top, I hesitated, peeking just over the edge. The hayloft was empty. The lantern sat in the middle of the floor, swaying gently as though someone had just set it down. It was old, its glass smudged with dust, and the flame inside flickered weakly. There was no sign of anyone else, no footprints in the hay, nothing. I stepped off the ladder, my boots crunching softly. The whispers had stopped, replaced by the steady creak of the lantern's chain as it swung back and forth. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the lantern. It was warm. That's when I heard it. A creak from the ladder. I spun around, my heart racing. The ladder shook, as though someone had started climbing it, but no one was there. I backed away, my legs trembling so badly I nearly stumbled. And then I saw it. A shadow, darker than the surrounding night, detached itself from the far wall and moved toward me. It didn't walk, it didn't float, it just moved, like it was being drawn toward me. I couldn't see any features, but I felt its gaze, heavy and cold, pinning me in place. The lantern's flame sputtered and went out. Panic overtook me. I bolted for the ladder, nearly slipping in my haste to climb down. The whole barn seemed to groan as though it was alive, the air thick and pressing in on me. I hit the ground running, barely registering the horses' frantic whinnies as I sprinted back to the house. Slamming the door behind me, I locked it and stood there, my chest heaving, waiting for something, anything, to follow. Nothing did. When my parents got home, I told them everything. My dad listened quietly, his face pale, and then told me something I'd never heard before. Years ago, when the barn was still new, a farmhand had fallen from the hayloft and died. He'd been carrying a lantern, and some said you could still see its light on stormy nights. I've never gone back into the barn after dark. And when a storm rolls in, I make sure the curtains are drawn. Because even now, years later, when I walk past the barn, I can see it. The faint glow of a lantern in the hayloft, swaying in the dark. And I never look up. Story 2, Cornfield Whispers. The cornfields were always peaceful, but that year something felt wrong. I grew up in a small town where cornfields stretched out as far as the horizon. They were a part of life, quiet, unchanging, and almost comforting in their predictability. That summer, I took a job helping out on a friend's family farm. The work was hard, but it paid well, and the fields were familiar to me. But something about that particular season felt different. It's hard to explain. The fields were the same as always, tall, green stalks swaying gently in the breeze, but the silence felt heavier, like the land itself was holding its breath. I ignored it at first, the heat, the long hours. I told myself I was just tired. It started on a late July afternoon. The sun was beating down and the air was thick with the smell of earth and corn. I was detasseling, walking row after row, pulling the tops off certain stalks to help the crops grow properly. It was monotonous, mindless work, but I didn't mind. At least it gave me time to think. About halfway through my row, I noticed something strange. Out in the middle of the field, far from where anyone should have been, stood a scarecrow. At first I thought it was normal enough, just a farmer's way of keeping birds away. But as I got closer, I realized it was odd. The clothes were wrong, too clean, and the hat looked brand new, like it had just been placed there. But what really stood out was its position. It wasn't tied to a post or propped up. It was standing, perfectly upright, as if it didn't need support. I shook my head and kept walking. Maybe someone had put it there as a prank. Kids got bored in small towns. But when I came back the next day, it was gone. That's when the whispers started. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling through the stalks. But the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It was faint, almost like someone muttering just out of earshot. I stopped and turned, scanning the rows behind me. Nothing but corn. "Hello," I called out, feeling stupid as soon as the word left my mouth. The field was empty. Of course it was. But then I heard it again. Closer this time. A soft, breathy sound, almost like my name. I dropped my bucket of corn tassels and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. By the time I reached the edge of the field, I was gasping for air. I laughed it off, telling myself it was my imagination. After all, who would be out there? Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Over the next few days, the whispers grew louder. They came and went, always when I was deep in the fields, far from anyone else. Sometimes I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eye, a flash of something dark slipping between and then, one evening, I saw it. I was finishing up for the day, the sun dipping low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the rows. That's when I noticed the scarecrow again. It was standing in the middle of the field, closer this time, facing me. But something was wrong. Its head tilted slightly, as if it were looking at me. The longer I stared, the more I realized it wasn't a scarecrow at all. Its skin was pale and stretched too tightly over its frame, its limbs unnaturally long. The clothes it wore were filthy, torn in places, and its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, were hollow, dark pits. It started to move. I froze, unable to look away as it stepped forward, the cornstalks parting around it. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, like 100 voices all speaking at once. I turned and bolted, my feet pounding against the dry dirt as I tried to get away. But no matter how far I ran, the whispers followed. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it, the hollow face, the way it moved so unnaturally, like it didn't belong in this world. The next day, I told myself I wouldn't go back into the field. I'd quit if I had to. But my friend's dad asked me to help finish one last section, and I didn't want to seem weak. I should have stayed home. It was late afternoon when I got lost. The rows of corn seemed to stretch on forever, and no matter how many turns I took, I couldn't find my way out. The whispers were constant now, circling me, echoing from every direction. "Stop," I muttered under my breath, gripping the tassel bucket like it was some kind of weapon. "Just stop." And then, the figure stepped out in front of me. It was taller than I remembered, its limbs impossibly thin, its head cocked to the side as though curious. It took a step closer, and I finally found my voice. "Stay back," I shouted, backing away. My foot caught on a root and I fell hard, the bucket scattering tassels everywhere. It loomed over me, the whispers so loud now they felt like they were inside my head. Its hollow eyes bore into mine, and for a moment I thought it was going to reach out and grab me. But then the wind picked up, rustling the corn, and the figure vanished, dissolving into the stalks like it had never been there. I didn't stop running until I was out of the field. My friend's family found me hours later, sitting on the porch, shaking and covered in dirt. I didn't have the words to explain what had happened, and even if I had, I doubt they would have believed me. I never went back to that farm, but every now and then when I drive past a cornfield, I hear the whispers, and sometimes I think they hear me too. Story 3, The Stranger by the Silo. I'd just moved to the farm looking for peace and quiet. What I found was something else entirely. I bought the farm in late spring. It was an old, sprawling property with weathered red barns, a rusting windmill and a towering silo that loomed over the fields. It had been abandoned for years, and I figured the isolation would be perfect, a place to start over and leave the noise of my old life behind. For the first few weeks, it was everything I'd hoped for. I spent my days fixing up the farmhouse, clearing out overgrown brush and tending to the few animals I'd brought with me. At night, I'd sit on the porch, staring at the endless stretch of stars. It was peaceful, until it wasn't. The first time I saw him, it was late. The sun had long set, and I'd just finished locking up the barn. As I walked back to the house, something caught my eye. Near the silo, half hidden in the shadows, stood a figure. At first, I thought it was one of the neighbors, though I hadn't met any yet. But the farm was so remote, it didn't make sense for anyone to just wander onto my property. "Hey," I called out, squinting into the dark. "Can I help you?" The figure didn't move. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was tall, with a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in shadow. His clothes were plain, old-fashioned even, and he stood completely still, facing the house. "Hello?" I tried again, a little louder this time. Nothing. A chill ran down my spine. The air felt heavier, the silence oppressive. Slowly, I stepped backward toward the house, never taking my eyes off him. When I reached the door, I fumbled with the lock, and by the time I glanced back, he was gone. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a trick of the light or some drifter passing through, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next night, I saw him again. This time, he was closer, standing halfway between the silo and the house. The same wide-brimmed hat, the same unnerving stillness. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, staring. I didn't bother calling out. Instead, I locked the doors and turned off the lights, peeking through the curtains as I clutched the old shotgun I kept by the bed. Hours passed, and he never moved. By morning, he was gone. On the third night, I heard the scratching. It started just after midnight, a faint, rhythmic sound like nails dragging against wood. I froze, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. It was coming from the bedroom window. I didn't want to look. Every instinct screamed at me to stay in bed, to pull the covers over my head like a scared child, but I couldn't ignore it. Slowly, I got up and crept to the window. The scratching stopped. Taking a deep breath, I pulled back the curtain. He was there, standing inches from the glass, his face still obscured by that damned hat, but this time I could see his hands. Long, pale fingers tipped with claws, pressed against the window. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the shotgun. My chest felt tight, my breath coming in shallow gasps. When I looked again, he was gone. That was it, I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing the shotgun, I threw on my boots and stormed outside, adrenaline drowning out my fear. The night was still, the air sharp with the smell of damp earth. "Where are you?" I shouted, my voice echoing across the empty fields. "What do you want?" There was no answer, but then I saw it. A trail of claw marks in the dirt, leading toward the silo. The door to the silo was ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze. My stomach churned, but I had to know. I approached slowly, my hands trembling as I raised the shotgun. Pushing the door open with the barrel, I peered inside. The walls were covered in deep scratches, gouged into the wood as if by something inhumanly strong. The floor was littered with bits of old hay and dust, but no sign of the man. A low guttural sound echoed from above, like a growl, or maybe a laugh. My blood ran cold. Whatever was in there, it wasn't human. I didn't wait to find out. I ran back to the house, locking every door and window before collapsing on the couch. I stayed up all night, gripping the shotgun, waiting for the sun to rise. By morning, the scratches on the window were gone, as if they'd never been there, but I knew what I'd seen. I left the farm a week later, sold it for half of what I'd paid, just to get away. I've since moved to the city, far from the isolation of the countryside, but sometimes I still dream about that scratching, sharp and relentless, dragging across the glass. And when I wake up, the window is always open. What would you have done if you saw someone or something standing in your yard? Story 4. The Cursed Well. They told me not to touch the old well on the property, but I didn't listen. The property had been in my family for generations, but it had sat empty for years after my grandparents passed away. Overgrown and forgotten, it was more of a relic than a home. But when the will passed it down to me, I saw it as an opportunity for a fresh start. The house itself was charming in a rustic way, but the land was wild, tangled with bushes and vines that seemed intent on swallowing everything. One corner of the property caught my attention almost immediately, a cluster of shrubs too dense to be natural. Curiosity got the better of me, and one afternoon I grabbed a pair of clippers and began hacking away. What I uncovered was a well. It was old, the stones dark with moss and weathered by time. The wooden cover was broken in places, revealing a deep black void. I felt a strange chill as I stared into it, as though the air around it was colder than the rest of the yard. When I mentioned it to one of the locals in town, their reaction was immediate. "Leave it alone," the old man behind the counter said, his eyes narrowing. "That well's been bad luck for as long as anyone can remember." I laughed it off. Superstitions weren't going to stop me from fixing up the property. Besides, it was just a well. What harm could it do? I decided to restore it, thinking it would add charm to the yard. Clearing away the remaining brush and debris, I replaced the rotting wood and fitted it with a new bucket and rope. By the time I was done, it looked like something out of a storybook. That night, the dripping started. It was faint at first, just a soft plink, plink, plink that I assumed was a leaky faucet. But when I checked, every tap was dry. The sound wasn't coming from the house. It was coming from the well. I stood on the porch, staring out at it, my breath fogging in the cool night air. The dripping was steady, echoing faintly across the yard, but it hadn't rained, and the bucket was dry. Uneasy but determined not to let it bother me, I went back inside and tried to sleep. That's when the nightmares began. They were vivid, too vivid. Each night I dreamed of falling into the well, the cold water closing over my head as I struggled to breathe. I could feel the icy grip of the water, hear my own gasps for air. Every time I woke up choking, my chest heaving like I'd just surfaced from drowning. The dripping sound continued every night. Sometimes it was louder, sharper, as if something was knocking against the stones. I tried to ignore it, but the more I did, the harder it became to sleep. And then, one night, I heard something else. It started as a faint, muffled cry, so quiet I almost thought I was imagining it. But as I approached the window, it grew louder. A voice. Help. It was coming from the well. I froze, my heart hammering. The voice was soft, weak, like someone barely holding on. But who could be down there? It didn't make sense. Grabbing a flashlight, I made my way outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. As I neared the well, the voice grew clearer. Help me, please. My hands shook as I shone the light down into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing but the old stones slick with moisture. But then, I saw it. My own reflection in the water at the bottom of the well. It smiled at me. The beam of the flashlight wavered as my breath caught in my throat. The face in the water wasn't mine, not really. It was distorted, the features stretched in ways that didn't make sense, and the smile, it was too wide, too sharp, like it was mocking me. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. The voice stopped, replaced by a deep, hollow silence that seemed to swallow everything. That night, I dreamed of the well again. But this time, I didn't wake up gasping. This time, I didn't wake up at all. I was underwater, the darkness pressing in around me, the cold seeping into my bones. Hands, too many hands, grasped at me, pulling me deeper. I couldn't scream, I couldn't fight, I could only sink. When I finally jolted awake, the room was freezing and my clothes were damp. But it wasn't sweat. The bed, the floor, even the walls were wet, as though I'd brought the water back with me. The final straw came a few nights later. The dripping had grown louder, more insistent, and the cries for help had returned. But this time, they were accompanied by something else, a low, guttural laugh that sent chills down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight and a hammer, determined to end it. As I approached the well, the laughter grew louder, echoing up from the darkness. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. No answer, only laughter. Peering over the edge, I saw it again, my reflection smiling up at me, but this time it moved. A hand shot out of the water, clawing at the stones as though trying to climb out. Before I could react, another hand grabbed my wrist, pulling me forward. I screamed, dropping the flashlight as I struggled against the icy grip. The laughter grew louder, echoing in my ears as I teetered on the edge. Somehow I managed to wrench myself free, falling backward onto the ground. When I scrambled to my feet, the well was silent again, but as I turned to run, I saw them. Wet footprints leading away from the well, toward the house. The next morning I packed what I could and left. I didn't care about the house, the land, or the inheritance. Whatever was in that well, it wasn't human, and it wasn't going to let me go. I've since moved to the city, far from the cursed property, but every now and then I dream of the well. In the dreams, I'm always falling, and I never hit the bottom. Story 5, The Watcher in the Woods. I've never been afraid of the woods until the night I saw it watching me. I've always loved the woods. There's something calming about the quiet, the way the trees seem to stretch forever, shutting out the noise of the world. So when a friend offered me their remote farmhouse for a weekend getaway, I jumped at the chance. It was the perfect escape. Just me, nature, and the freedom to hike for hours without seeing another soul. The farmhouse was charming, tucked at the edge of a dense forest, miles away from any neighbors. The air was crisp, the trees golden with the first hints of autumn, and I felt a sense of peace as I unloaded my bags. But that first hike, something felt different. I set out mid-morning, following a trail that wound deeper into the woods. The path was overgrown, but I didn't mind. It made me feel like I was discovering something untouched, something only I could see. About an hour in, I noticed the first of the stick formations. They were strange, almost like small tents or cages made from twigs lashed together with what looked like vines. At first, I thought they were natural, branches blown together by the wind. But the more I looked, the clearer it became that they'd been built by someone. The formations grew more intricate the farther I went. One had what looked like small animal bones hanging from it, swaying gently in the breeze. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were faint, coming from somewhere to my left, matching my pace. Whenever I stopped, they stopped. When I started walking again, so did they. I told myself it was nothing, probably a deer or some other animal curious about me. But as the trail narrowed and the trees grew thicker, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. When I finally turned around to head back, I felt a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like someone was right behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was no one there. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out of the woods. That night, as I sat by the fireplace, I heard a scratching at one of the windows. At first, I thought it was the wind, branches brushing against the glass, but when I looked, there were no trees near that side of the house. I peered out into the darkness, my breath fogging the glass. The yard was empty, but the scratching continued, faint but deliberate. I backed away, closing the curtains, and spent the rest of the night trying to convince myself I was imagining things. The next morning, I found a dead rabbit on the porch. Its body was mangled, the fur matted with blood. Deep claw marks raked across its sides, as though it had been caught and torn apart by something much larger than any predator I knew. I told myself it was just a fox or a coyote, even though I didn't quite believe it. I didn't go hiking that day. That night, the scratching returned. This time, it came from every window, the sound moving around the house as though something, or someone, was circling it. I turned off all the lights, sitting in the dark with a knife clutched in my hand. My phone had no signal, and the landline inside the farmhouse was dead. I felt completely isolated. Trapped. At some point, the scratching stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. The next morning, I found more dead animals, birds this time, scattered around the edge of the forest, and on the side of the house, just below my bedroom window, were claw marks. Deep, jagged gouges in the wood, like something had been trying to get inside. I wanted to leave. I should have left, but something about those woods called to me, like it wanted me to come back. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I grabbed a flashlight and ventured back into the forest. The trail felt different this time. Darker, narrower, as though the trees were closing in. The stick formations were everywhere now, larger and more intricate, some of them towering over me. I heard the footsteps again, but this time they didn't stop when I did. They grew louder, faster, closing the distance. When I finally turned around, the beam of my flashlight caught it. It wasn't human, though it stood upright like one. Its limbs were too long, its body too thin, the skin pale and stretched over sharp angles. Its face, or what should have been its face, was smooth, featureless except for two hollow pits where eyes should have been. It stared at me, though it had no eyes to see. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe as it took a step closer. Its head tilted to the side, as though curious, and then it reached out. The movement broke whatever spell I was under. I turned and ran, the flashlight bouncing wildly as I tore through the woods. The stick formation seemed to close in around me, their sharp edges slicing at my arms and legs as I passed. The thing followed, its footsteps impossibly fast, its breath if it even had breath, grasping like dry leaves. I don't know how I made it out. The next thing I remember, I was back at the farmhouse, slamming the door behind me and locking it. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. When I finally looked up, the claw marks were on the door. I left at sunrise, abandoning everything but my car and the clothes on my back. I didn't care about the deposit, the supplies I'd bought, or the fact that I hadn't told my friend I was leaving. I just needed to get out. I never went back to those woods, but sometimes, when I'm alone, I swear I see those same claw marks on my windows, my walls, my car, and I can still feel it watching me.